Thank you, Brian and Nicole, for inviting me. Really happy to come out, and I figured if I'm coming all the way, I might as well try to take on the biggest possible subject, the future of global development. I guess really I'm going to make one point today. I'm going to sort of make it over and over in many ways on all these slides you'll see in a second, but the basic point is that we're kind of entering a new world in terms of foreign aid. You see the tablet and the computer up there, which is meant to give you that sense. There are so many things that have happened in the modern era, and the easiest ones to point to when we think of paradigm shifts are things that technology has changed. In terms of foreign aid, it's not just technology, but technology is part of what's moving us into a totally different era. At Devex, one of the things we do is we have these listings of leaders, young leaders in global development, and we did one last week in London, the top 40 leaders in global development in London who are under 40 years of age. And I thought it was really interesting when I looked at the list that came out from the selection committee, half of them worked at organizations that didn't exist 10 years ago. The other half of their jobs didn't exist 10 years ago. And we're really entering a period where foreign aid, although it hasn't quite tipped over the balance yet, is moving in a totally new direction, and that's what I want to talk to you about. There are a lot of reasons this has happened, but the biggest one is that the developing world is changing. It's not necessarily that foreign aid is changing and changing the way things work, it's that the developing world is changing. And today, of the top 15 biggest economies in the world, you have countries like Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, China, India, countries where much of the world's poor actually live, are now among the richest countries in the world. It's a very different world than the developed world and the developing world, which is sort of the old paradigm we used to think of. And this has forced a total rethink in what is foreign aid, what is the point of it? Are we giving foreign aid to some of the richest countries in the world, and why? But even though you've got some of those examples of really rich countries in the top that have a lot of poverty within their borders, you still have countries at the bottom that are in a state of abject poverty, where basically everyone, for the most part in these countries, are just some examples, there's many more. This is what Paul Collier would call the bottom billion countries, right? So we're entering this new era where we can't have essentially a one-size-fits-all solution. This is a chart from The Economist, and if you look all the way on the right, you can see the percentage of the population of these countries that live on $2 a day or less. And what you've got is some of those really rich big countries in the top 15. Brazil is there, India is there, but you also have countries that are fairly substantial. They may not be in the top 15 biggest economies in the world, but you certainly wouldn't classify them in the bottom billion, and they have high percentages of people living under $2 a day. South Africa, which is one of the world's largest economies too, 40% of the population, $2 a day or less. Mexico is there at 45%. Pakistan at 88%. So what is the response? What does the world do? How do we approach this? The old way, and this is a very crude and simplistic way to put it, but the way foreign aid was money or commodities. We sort of gave the poor what they were missing. That was the idea behind it. But does that work when you're trying to help a country like Brazil? Does that work when you're trying to help a country like Indonesia that has a lot of its own resources? Is it just a question of needing goods or needing money, or is there something else we can do? And I think what we're entering now is this new era, and it's easy to show through technology, but it's really not just about technology, but a new era where we're creating more of a bottom-up global market around development. And this is creating a lot of new and innovative approaches. And it's changing the way we all think about foreign aid. It's happening in a very short period. I was just mentioning that at an event last week at USAID, the administrator there was talking about profits and development going together, right? We're entering a very new mindset that you might not have expected, even just a few years ago. So let me get into this a little bit. What does it mean? Well, traditionally on the left side of the screen is where we've been in foreign aid, and really where most of the money is today. There's about $120 billion in official development assistance. That's basically the rich countries of the world giving money to the poor countries of the world through their governments. It's about 120 billion or so. And most of that ends up going into projects. Okay, and projects have their own dynamics. So the US government or the British or the French government will give money to an NGO or to a company. that company will be given the money for 2 years or 5 years and told to achieve a certain result. They'll say, hey, there's a problem in this country, their health system isn't modern, we're going to modernize it. And they'll hire a company that knows a lot about technology for health and training bureaucracies in health, et cetera. That project model has a challenge. It tends to be very focused on the inputs, on the budget, on the schedule. Hey, did we finish the project in 5 years like we said? Did we spend the money like we said we were going to spend it? It's not necessarily as focused on what happens afterwards. And if you're running one of these projects and you find after year one, hey, we designed this thing all wrong. There's another direction we ought to head in. Do you have that flexibility to do that? You have the ability to say, hey, that $20 million contract we signed, it's not right for the situation right now. That's where much of what counts as development aid today is focused on today, and that's projects, okay? And for many of you who are thinking about a career in this field, most of the jobs in development for professionals are on projects. If you look at our website, which has a huge list of job opportunities, about 2,500 at any one time, the majority of those are not full-time staff positions at an organization. They are consultant positions on a project, because that's where most of the money in this industry ultimately goes. So what's the alternative to this project model? Well, there isn't really one easy approach. It's not projects, it's something else. But broadly, we can call it a business model. Okay? It's a different way of thinking about the way we're going to use foreign aid. And so there's a whole lot of new ideas that have come up, and these are some of the innovations. The first one is pretty straightforward, and that is budget support. And the idea there is some developing countries now have gotten to the point where they can really handle spending the money themselves. They don't need a foreign agency to come in and do it for them. So the money goes directly through that government. There are challenges with that, but it can be more efficient in the right circumstances. Microfinance, you're all familiar with, bottom of the pyramid, where you try to look at the poor as a market, where you can actually sell them something and create a sustainable business that creates jobs. Impact investing, helping to build up small and mid-sized companies in developing countries that both creates profits and sustainability and also has a social impact. ICT, information and communication technologies for development, ICT for D. Inventing and designing new technologies that you can use that are sustainable. There's a technology now with a basic cell phone, not a fancy phone, but the regular little chocolate bar phone that you see in much of the developing world. Community health worker can take a drop of blood, put it on a slide, put it behind the phone, take a picture, send it by MMS, and you can diagnose what conditions that patient may have. We're still a little bit early in these areas in terms of these technologies, but there's a lot of excitement around designing technologies specifically for global development purposes. Social enterprise, you're all very familiar with that. There's a lot happening in this field, nonprofits and for-profits who have social missions cooked into their overall reason for being as an organization. Corporate social responsibility, and even though CSR sometimes is looked at as kind of a marketing approach for companies, one thing that's positive about it is that it's paid for by the companies. It's part of their business, so it has some sustainability, even if it's not necessarily as impactful as everybody's hoping it might be. Business partnerships. This is where companies like Coca-Cola get together with an NGO that works in clean water, and they find a way. If you made a Venn diagram of the interests of the NGO and the local community around clean water and the interests of Coca-Cola, and there may be a piece there in the middle where they match. And if they do, then you make some kind of a partnership that's potentially lasting and transformative. This is not going to work everywhere in every circumstance, but more and more these kinds of opportunities are being found. And social bonds, I don't know how familiar you are with these, but essentially it's like putting a price on social performance. So this was started in the UK, where there were prisons that had really high rates of recidivism. People were going back to jail and back to jail again. Costs the state a lot of money, has a lot of negative social impacts. So they said, well, there's some local NGOs that actually think they know how to solve this problem a little bit better than the way the government is doing it. And those NGOs can then be incentivized and told, all right, you take over this challenge, and if you meet certain targets, you can actually make some additional profit. The government will pay you more because the government will actually save money working with you than if they still have these high rates of recidivism. And so based on that arrangement, that NGO can raise money in the private markets. And This is something which is just very early and new, but it's an example, like all of these, of new innovations in this new kind of business-oriented way of thinking about foreign aid. There are a lot of new donors, and this is, it's a new world. India has started its own donor agency. This is a country that even today is accepting foreign aid, but now they have their own agency that's giving foreign aid. Brazil is doing the same, and they're doing it in their own way. And in many cases, these countries, because they're so much more recently on the development curve, they're actually able to provide a different kind of perspective than some of the richest countries in the world. And there's even more donors coming. So many of you have heard of the Giving Pledge. There are so far 69 of the world's richest families that have pledged half of their wealth. It's not anymore going to just be a few big agencies that have all the resources and kind of set the policy. Where we're starting to head is toward kind of a competitive market, where you can see, well, what were the results of your foundation? And what were the results of that foundation? And what about that government agency? And what this creates for the first time, I think, is a bubbling up of the best ideas. Whereas in the past, you may have had, and this slide sort of shows it a bit, a different conception of foreign aid as charity, right? It was a foreign policy tool. So whether you had results or not, maybe it didn't matter if it was being given for Cold War purposes to prop up a government that a country was friendly with. We may have been thinking about transplanting our own model, our financial model or our government model. And you had just a few big donor nations that sort of controlled the whole system. Nowadays, it's not entirely changed, but you got a lot more donor agencies, dozens and dozens. The big ones are still kind of the same big ones. Japan, the US, the UK, the World Bank. There's still a few that are really at the top of the heap if you look at the distribution, but there's a lot of essentially competition to them. There's a lot of new agencies out there doing different things and creating new ideas and approaches. It's not yet fully competitive. It's more kind of fragmentation today, where these agencies are doing their own thing. And much of the aid that's being given is tied, which means that if the aid is coming, let's say, from the Japanese government, it has to go through a Japanese NGO or a Japanese company. That is still the case, but it's becoming untied. We're heading in this direction. And most of the money today still goes through government contracting models. But again, where we're heading, I think, and this slide shows this, we're heading into a new era where there's a much more focus on partnering with business. So it's not about aid agencies being out there on their own. There's more of a sense of partnering with countries. So we're not just coming in and setting up our own operation and a parallel system. I was talking to the finance minister of Liberia some months ago, and he was telling me that about 50% of the healthcare provision in his country goes through NGOs. And he actually doesn't know what they're doing. So he says, it's great that they're providing healthcare. We need it desperately. But he will go to parts of the country and discover there's a clinic that he didn't know was there, or there's a hospital that he didn't know was there. And it's very hard to have a national state health system, right, if you don't actually control the way it operates or have a say in the way it operates. So different countries are at different stages in being able to take over their systems, but one of the things that we've learned the hard way is in many countries when donor agencies come in and sort of set up parallel systems to the government, when it's time to leave, there isn't a lot of capacity left. The country doesn't really have the ability to sustain whatever was brought there. And this Afghanistan is one example, a kind of a tragedy example right now, where after spending so much money in aid it's not clear there's enough capacity that if these aid agencies were to leave and sort of write the check instead to the Afghan government, that you would get real results from that. But more and more money is going through countries that show they're able to handle it. So the UK is now giving more than 60% of their aid through developing country systems, what's known as budget or sector support, where the money might go through a health ministry, for example. The US is beginning to do that more and more, something we just a few years ago thought would never happen here, mainly for political reasons, and it's happening. So this is something which I think has often been looked at as a black or white issue. Either you give the money to the developing country directly or you don't. And when you talk to people in, say, Europe Aid in Brussels, they'll say, well, it's more about picking the right situation for the right country. Eventually, we want to give the money directly through countries and their own systems. Not everyone's going to be ready for that immediately, but that's where we're heading. This idea of competition, donors and implementers starting to actually compete with each other. You know, do you have the best idea, or does another organization have the best idea? This is not something which can happen until you have transparency around results, and that's starting now. And I think we're going to see that coming in the future. This is largely an optimistic picture I'm painting, but I really think we're heading toward a better system, from a contracting model to a business model, and where you can invest in innovation or science or technology because there's actually a reward for it. That if you make that investment and improve the way you deliver health services, someone will be there to say, yeah, we'll fund that, because that actually works. It's more effective aid. So what is this going to mean for all the players? And this is a little bit of inside baseball for those of you who are not yet in the development industry, but these are kind of the main players in the industry that is development. So if you're a donor agency, if you're USAID or the British government's agency, DFID, what you've got to do is be more specialized now. There's so many more donors. There's so many more players. You can't say, well, we do everything in global development. We cover every country in the world and every sector, and we solve every problem. That's probably unrealistic. So what we've already seen happen, the Swedes are doing this at CETA, the Brits are doing this at DFID, is reducing the number of countries. I think about 25 offices have already closed, that DFID has closed around the world. USAID is doing the same thing, closing missions where we don't need them, and specializing more, saying, okay, this is the area our donor agency really focuses on. This is what we know. We're not trying to solve every problem. You're also going to see, I think, more partnership with the countries, so less of governments coming in and saying, this is what we're going to do for you, but rather realizing that development is in the hands of the countries themselves. They're the ones who develop themselves, and so reaching out to say, how can we assist in your own development plan, not bring you ours. There's something called the Partnership for Growth, which is being experimented with at USAID now, and actually it's across the U.S. federal government, where they picked 4 countries and they're trying to work with them to develop economic growth plans. It's still early to say how that's going to go, but at least the concept is that the developing country owns their own development, which is an important way to look at this, I think. Transparency and metrics. You may have heard of publish what you pay, publish what you fund. There are a number of campaigns going on to try to force the aid industry, which has historically been pretty closed about what they're doing, to say, hey, this is what we do. And for those of us at Devex, this is a real challenge for our reporters and researchers. And we hear about a project and we want to write something about it on our website. We can't find out who won this project. What's the status of it? And sometimes we'll call aid offices around the world, and they'll say, we don't ourselves know exactly what's going on in the country that we have responsibility for. We don't ourselves know what the status of every project is. So there's a lack of information. It's very hard to manage for results when you don't know exactly what's going on. International NGOs, what's going to happen to them? I think there's going to be a lot of merger and acquisition activity, actually, among international NGOs. I know that sounds a little strange, but what you've had is, in the last 10 or 20 years, NGOs that started in the US or in the UK or in France become global. And now there are so many of them covering some of the exact same issues, appealing back to the exact same constituencies for funding, that just like the donors have to be more specialized, I think some of these international NGOs will themselves become more specialized. And one of the ways they'll do that is by merging. So I think we're going to see a bit more of this happen. I think their niche is going to more and more be the poorest countries, the most difficult situations in the world. Because if you're an international NGO, do you really need to be operating in a place like Brazil or India, which has a lot of its own NGOs? What is your role there exactly? Maybe you're there to support financially domestic NGOs, but I think increasingly those NGOs in places like India and Brazil will build their own funding bases, their own domestic resources, and have their own programs for their country. So the place where there's a gap is the poorest countries, the post-conflict countries, the fragile states. And I think international NGOs are increasingly going to focus more and more on those. I think sort of like the Obama campaign did in 2008 of raising huge amounts of money in small donations, and groups like Global Giving and Kiva now are doing in their own way, I think international NGOs will more and more be able to benefit from leveraging crowdsourced aid. If you get a brand that's globally known as, hey, those are the guys who know a lot about addressing energy issues at the village level, and they can provide microgrids and electricity at a village level the most cost-effective way, and you can get a fan base around the world of people who say, yeah, I believe in that, I think that's important. There are now new ways to raise money than there have been before. You may not be just dependent on one wealthy donor or one government to fund you. The implementers, and by this I mean mainly companies that exist to implement development projects, there's a lot of mergers and acquisition activity happening there too, lots. Two of the biggest just merged a couple of weeks ago. They just announced it to create a company that now has a budget of $225 million a year. There are several now around the world that are in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year of aid money that goes through them, and they go and implement projects. So they similarly are feeling this is becoming global. There's competition. It matters whether I do a really good job or I don't. And it's a good thing in a way. It's creating an industry that's got to be a little bit more accountable. I also think there's a new opportunity for these implementing companies, and that is to be the brokers, the nexus between the companies, the NGOs, the governments. These players don't always know how to work together. And so there are a lot of new companies that have cropped up that help bring them together and structure partnerships. I talked about Coca-Cola working with a local NGO. Oftentimes that's not going to happen on its own. There may be a company that comes and helps bring them together. So there's a whole new business opportunity there in a sense. I already mentioned about the middle income NGOs. Development professionals, I guess all of you, what's going to happen when you want to enter this field as a professional. I think we're getting past the days of sort of plane loads of Americans and Europeans going to developing countries to do development work. I still think there will be a key role for international expertise from anywhere in the world, but it's going to be much more specialized, and it's going to require a higher threshold of knowledge and skill to get those kinds of positions. The competition is global now, and just as I mentioned, aid is becoming untied, jobs are becoming untied too. So it's not that American NGOs and companies have to hire Americans for every position anymore, and the same goes for so many other parts of the world. They now have options, and this is a great thing, in part because there's so many middle-income countries that have lots of people going through higher education now who can fill a lot of the traditional aid and development jobs. So this is going to change, I think, the way development professionals think about their career. It's not just enough to say, I want to go abroad and do a good thing. You've got to really have a core skill set in an area that's needed. And the bar for that's going to be higher. I particularly think knowledge of technology and business is going to be key. So it's not going to be enough to say, I understand the social side or I understand the technical expertise around, say, health systems. It's going to be important to understand the market dynamics too. What are the incentives for local pharmacies in sub-Saharan Africa? Since there's so many of them are privately owned, so many clinics are privately owned, what is that market like? What is that business like? How could I intervene or utilize or leverage those markets to create a development impact? And understanding business models, kind of like an MBA might think about them, I think is going to become a key skill set for development professionals. Technology, not that people need to be programmers, but I think development professionals need to know enough about the range of technologies out there, from low tech to high tech, to be able to incorporate them in development planning and programming. So very often, a development project nowadays has technology as kind of a line item. It's somewhere in the budget. It's travel and there's office space and technology. But I think we're getting to a point where it's no longer going to be a line item. It's going to be part of the strategy behind the program to begin with. It's going to be cooked in. So to be at the table developing that program or that project or that intervention or that business, you've got to know enough about the opportunity to use technology to achieve whatever the result might be. So I think this is the world we're heading to. I just want to end on this last slide, which there's no way you're going to all read this, but this is a great infographic if you haven't seen it before. And this is to say, none of what I'm telling you is, hey, aid is bad and we shouldn't do aid. In fact, probably should do more aid, but it's about doing it better than the way we've done it. This is just a graph which compares spending on the military globally to spending on aid and shows what a tiny fraction of that aid is. There is still a huge opportunity to create gains for the world by investing aid intelligently in places that desperately need it. It's just a question now about finding ways to do it better than we've done before. And I think we're now in an era, to go back to sort of my beginning point of foreign aid 2.0, we're now in this new era where we're going to think of aid differently. The way it's done is going to be different. The players and actors are going to be different. And it's all happening very quickly. I think it will be a new era relatively soon. In the next few years, we'll enter this new paradigm.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Got an opportunity for questions and discussions. I'll let you.
And tell me I'm wrong too. Feel free.
Yeah, exactly. I'll let you recognize you're wrong. Let's kick things off, Richard.
Yeah, another question. I just want to know: is this slide on your website? This one here?
This slide comes from a great magazine called Good Magazine.
Uh-huh.
So it's on their website, but I'm pretty sure if you just Google grenade or aid, it should come up. Yeah. I see a hand back there.
Yeah. I worked in AEB's communications department until June.
Okay. So you know a bit about what I'm talking about?
My question is about so the international NGOs and changing size of international NGOs.
Yeah.
And the way they're branding their own niches, and the niches they respond to. I'm wondering, what your opinion is on. I don't know if there's been an appearance that niches in international development is a new thing as much as niches are changing. There's different niches, and that being, for the example you gave, like the niche in fragile states as a
Right.
niche market, or rather than separating certain things that have been considered distinct sectors, there's now much more demand for cross-sectoral, and how that influences then the mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah. It's a great question. So I think what's driven a lot of the biggest NGOs in the world has been their need for funding, right? And so if the place you get a lot of your funding is a bilateral aid agency like DFID, and DFID is moving into new areas, then you say, well, I got to make sure my NGO is operating in those areas, because otherwise we're not going to get any of the funding. The latest sector is renewable energy, or it's HIV. I better work in that area. But as we get into this global market where you're not just dependent on your country's government aid agency anymore for funding as an NGO, you're really in a global competition. And as your government's funding agency says, we're not doing renewable energy anymore. That's not our core specialization. We're only doing these few other areas. I think it requires a rethink for some of these big global NGOs. Well, what is our real reason for being around? What is our focus? Let's not just go wherever the funding might be. Let's make sure we've got a brand that the average person out there can associate with something specific that we do really well. And I still think there will be some huge global NGOs out there that cover a lot. There just may not be as many as there are today. Some of the ones that are in the middle may rise up and get bigger. Some of them might get smaller or get absorbed by other organizations.
Do you see government, in particular the U.S. government, playing a larger role, giving more as time goes on? Right now we're seeing sort of empty giving anyone anything,
Right.
probably because of the economy.
Right.
Do you think that's going to go? Will that sort of ignoring that little bump? Would you think the U.S. government will continue to play a similar role, higher role, in terms of giving? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I think we will have a reduction, maybe 20 to 30% of the aid budget over the next few years. But I think we're not going to go back to where we were in the 90s. So in 1997, U.S. aid budget was down to about $7 billion, a little bit less than $7 billion. And what changed between then and now is that there is a broad coalition that believes foreign aid is a good thing. So it used to be kind of a Republican versus a Democrat thing. That's not really the case anymore. In fact, the aid budget tripled under George W. Bush. And you had a coalition of evangelical Christians, Hollywood celebrities, leaders on both sides, from Presidents Bush to Obama, that got together and said, no, we can actually see a need for this. Oftentimes it was around health issues that were the most galvanizing for both sides. But I think we've reached a new era where there are, of course, people who say, foreign aid is not the right thing, it's a waste of money, et cetera. That's still out there to some degree, but I don't think it's anything like it was in the days when Jesse Helms was, drastically reducing the U.S. aid budget in the 90s. So I think the current pressures in the U.S. and really in all the rich countries of the developed world that are all sort of broke in a way and in debt in a big way, that is going to cause some austerity in the aid budget, no question about it. In a way, it's a good thing because it's going to galvanize this issue of finding ways to spend the money better. Whatever you have, whatever's available, there's going to be more focus on what the results are. So in the UK, David Cameron there has cut the UK federal budget by about 25%. I mean, it's really quite extreme. And I mean, there were riots in the streets and thousands of people losing jobs, et cetera. And at the same time as doing that, they decided to increase their aid budget. And you can imagine, even though the country is quite pro-aid and engagement in the world, this caused a lot of controversy. And so the way they're trying to stick with this plan is they've got this slogan, value for money. And they're essentially trying to show the British people that we've got real value for the money that's being spent. And so that's caused them to change a number of the things they do, including closing offices all over the world and refocusing on certain sectors, cutting, they did a study of what they thought were the most effective multilateral agencies in the world. And they came out and said, we think the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, is not very effective. And they said this, very publicly, is quite controversial, and they cut their funding to them. So this is what I mean by competition, right? Now, this one UN agency that thought, maybe we always get this check from the UK government every year, they're not getting it in a very public way. And that's forcing them to make some change. So in terms of the United States, I think we will see a dip, and it may last for quite a while, depending on how long the economic situation here lasts. But I don't believe that as a country we're as anti-foreign aid as we once were. I don't see those dynamics anymore in the country to the degree they once were. If the economic situation gets much worse, things can certainly get worse in terms of the aid budget, but I think there's enough of a coalition at this point. There's a couple of groups in Washington. One is called the USGLC, U.S. Global Leadership Campaign. And if you look at their members, it's something you'd be kind of shocked to see 15 years ago. It's the CEOs of just about every big American company, including defense contractors, companies like Caterpillar and Coca-Cola, and really big corporations, plus the CEOs of all the big NGOs, from Save the Children to Plan, Oxfam. Everybody's together. They're all going together to Capitol Hill and saying, we need to engage in the developing world, we need our foreign aid budget. So this is a new dynamic that didn't exist when we were in the really dark days of the mid-90s.
Two questions that came out of that. First, with the U.S. government, what do you think, as a donor country, what do you think are the things that the U.S. does well or better relative to its relative to peer donor countries? And then two, I'm wondering if you feel that Devex contributes to a playing field that's slanted in favor of some of the larger, more established organizations? And what do you guys do to create a space for the smaller, newer organizations to be competitive for funding?
Good question. So I think the U.S., there was recently an OECD study, right, which they do these peer reviews where they go around to the developing countries that are the developed countries that are part of the OECD. And U.S. government has been really touting the fact that they got a pretty good review from the OECD, and the area that they got a really good review was their partnerships with business. So something called the GDA, the Global Development Alliance. So that was started in the U.S. 10 years ago. It was kind of an innovator in the space. And it appears that this administration is going to back that even more and put more money into public-private partnerships. I think for those of us in the United States who are going to work in this field, this is going to be sort of the bull market of public-private partnerships. And it's an area we've got to get to know because it's going to be such a focus. It goes a little bit back to your question of how do you develop that coalition? And businesses see this as a positive thing too. This kind of gets all sides of the spectrum together. I'm sure there are many other areas in the U.S. program that they would ultimately say, hey, these are important focus areas for us that we should specialize in. I'm not sure what the sectors would be, but in terms of countries, based on our foreign policy, it's very likely that we're going to continue to be engaged in post-conflict and fragile states. And from a foreign policy perspective, not necessarily a development policy perspective, if you look at how to divide up the pie of foreign aid money, I think it's going to remain in places like Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia. Once you put those countries aside, what's left for places where we used to have a much stronger presence is going to be much smaller, I think, just realistically. In terms of Devex, this is kind of, we see this change in the world as a perfect time for us, and we hope we're part of it in a sense. That as this market becomes more of a market, that there's actually more competition, we want to be the platform for it, where there's a place that everyone can kind of plug in and see who's doing what, and the small NGO that has a really good idea can say, hey, here I am, this is the thing I'm doing, these are my results, how can I play in this market? So one of the areas where I think big organizations have been really advantaged in the past is on recruitment. Because in the project model, the way you get money is by bidding on a contract or a grant. And most of your score on that contract or grant is the team that you put together. So if you want to win this particular project in Uzbekistan, there's one person who really knows all about it, and you get that person as your chief of party in US aid parlance, your team leader. You kind of are a shoo-in a sense. And smaller organizations had a hard time getting the prominence in the industry to get consultants, the really top people, to know they exist, to be willing to go in with them on a proposal. So what we've done for the small organizations is in some ways level the playing field, because now they have access through us to this database of the top consultants in the world. So we've got about 370,000 people now registered on Devex who are experts at all different levels, including people at the entry level, but lots of top experts too. So what small businesses tell us is this is really interesting for us because now we have access to a pool of talent that we never had before, that the really big organizations could compete with us, and they had that internally. They had in-house their own databases. And so I wouldn't say we've entirely leveled that playing field yet. There's a lot of advantages to being big. I actually think the groups that are going to have the hardest time in this new market are the ones in the middle, not necessarily the very small organizations, because I think you can be small and specialized, or you can be really big and global. But if you're in the middle, I think you're going to have the hardest time, because you still have to be a little bit of, you have to do a little bit of everything. You're not going to be able to compete against small groups that do those specific things really well. You may not have the resources to have an on-the-ground presence everywhere that the big guys do. And we've already seen some of that shaking out. Part of it is the mergers and acquisition activity, where the biggest organizations are going in and buying up some of the mid-sized companies or mid-sized organizations. And we just want to be part of the dynamic of creating transparency about who's out there and connecting everybody in the market. We're not going to necessarily control what the outcome of that is, but that's what we want to add as an organization to this dynamic.
You mentioned fragile states.
Yeah.
And excuse me, I'm wondering whether there often is a temporal binary between conflict and post-conflict, often in the context of humanitarian versus more development-oriented organizations. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that and maybe how that fits into your new paradigm.
Yeah, it's a good question, and there's a lot of discussion around, is there a line between the two? Is there a phase in the middle, and is this line blurry? I don't really know the answer to when we should call something humanitarian aid and when we should call it development. But I do think the challenge is that we now have these countries that we call fragile for years and years and years. It's not a humanitarian emergency that lasts 6 months, like maybe after an earthquake. It's decades. So in that circumstance, do you not do development at all, and you just call it a humanitarian emergency? So I think what's happened is the traditional humanitarian groups have gotten into development, and the traditional development groups have gotten into humanitarian work because they're sort of forced to by the circumstances of many of the countries where they work. I don't know the answer of whether we should have some clear dividing line between the two, but I do think we ought to be thinking for countries that appear to be mired in an emergency state for years and years, there ought to be more of a long-term plan of some kind, not just constantly providing humanitarian relief without thinking through where is this going to go and how does the country get out of this circumstance. Sure.
Can I jump in and
Please.
push a little? You invited pushback. So
Please push back, yes.
Let me push back a little bit of the view of where things are going. And I guess as I look at that, there are some gaps that appear to me. And I'd be interested in your take, how these are going to be filled. One is the types of countries that are going to receive aid. And as you talk about more and more aid going to governments or to ministries so they can be administered there for there's ownership.
Yeah.
that is fine if you have confidence in that government and if they have a good set of institutions, right?
Yes.
If you're a government with a crappy set of institutions, perceptions of large-scale corruption
Yeah.
is a very unattractive model, right? You're
Absolutely.
sitting in Dambiso Moyo's world without
Sure.
any response to it.
Sure.
So that leads to a second set of concerns, whereas a lot of the problems that exist in the world and the challenges when you come to education, healthcare, some of these areas where public goods are a big part of the solution.
Yeah.
A lot of that is about building institutions, building
Absolutely.
governance capacity, which seem much less amenable to market types of approaches and much longer term in terms of how you would get there. So as the world shifts in response to those kinds of incentives that you laid out, is this going to drop? Are these types of things likely to be neglected? And the third area that I guess I would ask about is the hardest problems. If it is a competition, I'm going to focus on the easy problems,
Yeah.
the things that are relatively solvable. And if I'm a donor, and donors are increasingly looking at these kinds of metrics and data, you're going to have more and more money go to those things. We're already seeing a lot of that if you look at the major foundations, the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation,
Yeah.
foundations that particularly used to invest huge amounts into civil society development, right? The human rights organizations, the small grassroots organizations on the ground. You know, what are they going to produce today or tomorrow? Probably not very much.
Yeah.
But that money is coming out of those organizations and now going into things like war crimes tribunals where you can actually count it. You can say this
Right.
many people were
Right.
indicted and all. But you know, we know through history that large-scale social movements have been responsible for fundamental change in the sustainability of that change. So are we in a world where one of the artifacts of this shift is going to be a move away from certain types of countries, certain types of problems, and certain types of approaches to social change?
Great questions. So let me tackle the first one, which is this issue of corruption, right? How do you give money directly to the Afghan government or to the Liberian government? Two cases I brought up before. We were working actually on a report. We've got a reporter working on the Afghanistan situation specifically. And you know, I read the draft of the piece that came out, and I didn't love it because it sort of leaned on this issue of you just can't trust the government in Afghanistan, so you know, how can you give them money? So I talked to a friend of mine who's actually working out there, and this is his job. He's got one of the, I think, most challenging jobs on the planet, which is to train up local Afghan government units out in the field to be able to administer funds, you know, budgeting and procurement processes and all the rest. So I talked to him about it, and he's a veteran of Iraq as well. He did similar work in Iraq. And I said, you know, we're all just depressed here reading the draft of this report. There's no solution, right? And he said, well, in a way, there is none, and it is all very depressing. But he said, I am convinced that there's just no long-term solution if you don't work through the government. That maybe it means we have to be more realistic about how much money we can put through. So we might say, hey, we've got an aid budget to give $100 million to the health ministry of Liberia. Well, they're not going to be able to absorb that. This is his view in that time frame. So we've got to change our lens a little bit in how we look at this. But his view is you've got to make working through the government and building their institutions the number one priority. Because if you don't do that, you're simply creating a problem that's not going to be solved. Over and over again, it's not going to be solved. I think this is kind of the wicked problem, right? You can't give the money directly yourself on the ground because you build up a parallel structure to the government. You can't give the money to the government because it's corrupt and the money's going to get wasted. But you've got to do something. So I think the new approach, the new thinking is, even though we know it's going to be harder to work through the government, we better try. We better make that a priority. We might not do everything through the government, but we better work toward that being part of the eventual solution, because if not, we're just building up compounds in the capital city of European contracting organizations that are sort of taking the place of what the government ought to be there doing. And that certainly is not going to solve the problem in the long run either. So I don't suggest it's going to be flipping a switch one to the other, but I do think that is a direction that makes real sense for the aid industry to think about, to kind of change the way we look at this issue. On the issue of like public sector solutions for things like health and education. I absolutely agree that those are about building institutions. But in much of the developing world, the provision of healthcare and education is done through the private sector. So I don't think you need to have a one or the other approach. I think the solution in many places may be building up the public sector institution into a really effective financing agency that then funds nonprofit or for-profit schools, but doesn't necessarily try to go out and build an entire infrastructure of schools around the country, or that funds private clinics and hospitals and pharmacies, but doesn't necessarily try to go out and replicate what we have in the United States or what exists in Europe. So I think we need to think through the fact that institution building is a critical component. It's not all going to happen directly through business. Kind of goes back to that first point about building up the government. But the answer may not look like what we've got here or what we've got in Europe. It might be more about leveraging existing private sector entities in a lot of these countries. And I think in particular, pharmacies in Africa are a really interesting opportunity because there's so many of them. They tend to be privately owned, and they tend to be the place where people go to get health services because there really isn't often much else where they are. So that's a huge opportunity. If you can create an incentive for the pharmacy, a business incentive, to provide additional services, you can have an infrastructure for health service that sort of exists today but isn't being fully leveraged. So this is what I mean about the kind of new lens on how to solve these issues. And then to your last point, I absolutely agree this is a real threat about this new paradigm. I was talking to somebody who started an NGO in South Africa, which takes really troubled kids who've gone through the most horrific things as young kids, and then brings them through school, and it's a totally holistic program. It's not just school, it's providing them with shelter and with the right environment and everything that you could possibly need, and kind of brings them up into young adulthood, and they end up becoming really productive citizens. And he says, my problem is, if you look at what I spend to get a kid through this, it's an enormous amount of money. And when the foundations look at it, they say, gosh, that's like the Cadillac problem, the Cadillac solution. We can take that money and give it out through bed nets and solve so many kids who won't get malaria as a result. And he says the challenge with that is you're missing, you're not really doing an accurate cost-benefit assessment because the time horizon, and it kind of gets to your example of building democracy movements. The time horizon on that might be 20 years. But if you could really do a full return on investment calculation over that entire time frame, it might have been the cheapest thing we've ever invested in, was building a democracy movement. So there is a short-termism problem, which I think exists in markets, which could begin to afflict this field. And I think it's something that hopefully, with this more competitive approach and new sources of funding, there will be smart philanthropists or smart agencies that say, we actually think there's an ROI for some of these long-term things, and we're going to invest in them too. And we're going to specialize in them, and maybe we're going to do a better job measuring them in ways that others haven't done before. But I agree it's something to keep an eye on, because it's a natural human reaction to say, oh, I'm not going to get any credit for that next year. Why will I fund it?
Yeah, get back over here.
And then I see Richard, yeah.
Sorry.
Hi, and sorry I've had my back to all of you during all this. Go ahead.
Several years ago, more like 10 years ago, a bunch of friends and I got together and we started our own NGO here in the United States. And the big problem was money.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't use money. We went ahead and we started collecting the surplus of hospital beds, school desks, and all that, and exporting them to the Dominican Republic and Mexico and destinations around the United States. And so, the big focus was basically a barter economy we created by taking the surplus out of hospital basements. They use a bed for a couple years, put it in a basement, let them accumulate, then throw them out.
Yeah.
So same thing with school desks, sheets, chalkboards, all that stuff would be garbage in the United States. In another country, it became a treasure. So through the U.S. military and through the Dole pineapple, we created a supply chain and got the product over there. We did not use money. So my big question is, what are organizations starting to do to think about, this kind of barter and alternate economy? We didn't get people to give us money. We got them to give us transportation,
Mm-hmm.
container space, and then at the other end, the receiving organization, some organization had to receive it and distribute it. We did not go through the government because places like the Dominican Republic just stole the hospital beds and sold them again.
Yeah.
but it ultimately got there. So I'm curious to know what organizations are doing out there about barter economies in general.
I love the concept. I don't know too much about what's going on in terms of using bartering as a model, but I think the concept makes so much sense. It sort of reminds me of this new hot website some of you might have heard of, Airbnb. Y'all know Airbnb, right? Basically, they've similarly found like what we would sort of consider wasted assets.
Yeah.
People's living rooms when they're traveling, and they put them online now and let you rent them out to people, and they now have more rooms than Hilton hotels have globally on Airbnb. And I think similarly, if you started adding up things like beds that aren't being used or medicines that aren't being used and allowed to expire, you may find the total scale of that is dramatic, right, compared to what actually we send over through foreign aid. So I absolutely agree with the concept. I'm not too familiar with anybody doing anything about it now, other than people using the military's surplus. There's a NGO called Counterpart in the Washington area, which has the contract through the State Department to take all the military surplus supplies, which are things like medicines and food and all kinds of supplies. And the amount is staggering. I mean, it's warehouses full of this stuff from all over the world, and they get it in containers, and their only cost is the transport, and they get it overseas to people who need it. But it's what I guess what you've done is sort of what I'm trying to say is where we're going. And that is, instead of this just being a few rich country governments sort of having a policy around aid and that's it, we're going to have this bubbling up where people say, I've got a great idea. And then if your model works, someone says, hey, did you hear about this? They're sending this stuff to the Dominican Republic, and this is their return on investment. It's really inexpensive and it's effective. And then a foundation or an agency or somebody picks it up, and there's now an opportunity to actually scale it. Whereas I think in the past it's been really tough, and I get lots of entrepreneurs coming to our offices all the time saying, hey, I've got this really good idea and this is what I've done. How do I break into the aid system? And the answer has usually been, sorry, it's going to be really tough. You got to go to private donors, friends and family, small philanthropies, but to break into the big system, it's really challenging. It's sort of closed off. And I think that's what's changing now, that an idea like yours could actually make it and scale up and go global.
Well, I just went to a couple of countries, but
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. No question, but just a couple of comments here.
Mm-hmm.
The first time we had a major conference here in 2005 on aid governance and development. My name is Richard Jose. I'm political science.
Yes.
Probably Brian. And we published an edited book called Smart Aid for African Development. But so what I'm hearing here is almost like the next volume of that, Smarter Aid. So a lot of it resonates to me. Just a couple points to, in terms of some of the things you said. In this idea of business approaches, let me give you something you might just add to, an example. And in fact, Abid Bandar was one of our students, just came back from Senegal. And I worked with the Ford Foundation for a couple of years in the late 80s. And this would be the Ford Foundation. And Ford didn't do much for profit, but one of the most important grants we did then was to set up a media company called Sood. And Sood now, and by it setting it up in that way, it has been sustainable. And in fact, Sood is now at the forefront of a lot of the struggles of civil society. So if you want to look at an example of how the business approach could, connect, I would mention that
Okay.
Sood, and it's, established. A couple of other things. Talking about how you work in, in corrupt environments, and Brian would know that having been running a project in Nigeria for the past 5 years, I am up to my neck in it. But the idea about innovations, sometimes you think of it in blanket sense. But I'll just give you one specific case in terms of the REACH program that we had. We had a lot of field researchers and so on, and you have the normal problem of the money going astray even from people and so on. And somebody came up with a suggestion of having all of our field research open bank accounts. And for many of these people, this is something they've never done. But once they open a bank account, we were able to make the payment in Ibadan, where our headquarters, and in the next 24, 48 hours, people could go to, and there was the money. And for many people, this was such a surprise. But it means now the whole process of how you deal with all of this was eliminated just by, again, it's a kind of a modern technology we're used to, but in a concept like that. And the last point is what Brian said about institutions. You know that this is, this is basically my mantra. But there also, Fukuyama in his recent book, which is very important, I recommend to everybody. But when he talks about it, and he has this phrase that I think is now as important as Thomas Hobbes's poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And it's long, costly, laborious, and difficult. So the most important thing is how do you build institutions? Mm-hmm. But let me just tell you, as anybody knows, this is one of the hardest things to do.
Yeah.
So you really have this real paradox. But but anyway, those are just comments. But a lot of this is and lastly, I mean, I'm presently involved in some work is trying to establish a platform for dealing with some of these governance and development issues and working with people who are well versed in technology and so on. So you might be hearing from me to really learn from your experience. Huh?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the comments.
Perfect. I
There's
saw
one-
hands up otherwise. So
And there's one behind
oh,
you
I'm
too.
sorry. Go ahead and grab the one behind. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Miranda, and I'm studying economics and geography. So one of the most important things that I'm concerned of is food aid, because we had such delicious food today, and there's a lot of famine happening in like a lot of countries in the world, like Malawi and Nigeria, and the thing with food aid is that it has so many constraints. It's like some countries have droughts, or it's constrained by weather, or like I know they have abandoned land, or they don't have enough technology, and at the same time, the U.S. is a big producer of lots of the grains, but U.S. government would rather give the farmers subsidies, and the farmers would dump those food or simply burn them instead of giving them to those developing countries. So what do you think the future of food aid would be?
Well, that's a big question, probably big enough for another presentation. I'll just say this about food aid. This market mentality that I've been describing has come to the food aid world. So you're talking about essentially a market distortion through subsidies, right? In the past, another market distortion was that food aid was often just brought from outside a country and dumped in the local market. And that hurt local farmers, created disincentives to grow. And so this market thinking has entered into the world of food aid, and now the World Food Program and many others are looking at how do our programs affect local markets? And maybe we can, instead of bringing in outside food aid, grow it locally and incentivize local farmers and start to build up supply chains and build institutions around an agriculture industry, which will be more sustainable for the next famine that comes, or maybe even prevent the next famine. So I don't think it's a silver bullet kind of solution, but this way of thinking about it differently has already created some really positive steps forward in the food aid world. And I believe that World Food Program in particular, and I think they've got a program in South Sudan that's exactly focused on this and might be worth looking at. They have changed dramatically the way they approach this issue because of a market lens on what happens in food aid.
I was just curious. I was actually with the World Food Program for the past year. And,
Did I get it right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. But I was curious about the question of, like, how do you get all of these innovations to scale? What do you think will be the tipping point so that you see mobile technology, for example, being used across the board? One of the things that I saw was here we talk about social entrepreneurship, and we talk about ICT development, et cetera. But on the ground, it's just not to the scale that, for example, food aid is. So what do you think will tip the scale so that this doesn't become widespread?
I think if you can make it into a market. So take an example of M-Pesa, which is the mobile banking technology in Kenya. That was started as an aid program, in a sense, right? It was Vodafone's foundation, and they went to Safaricom, and they said, hey, there's this technology, you can trade money online and set up a bank account. And the Safaricom CEO said, I can make this a business because I can't enter the banking market in Kenya. It's totally closed off and regulated. I'll go around them using my mobile phones and my relationship with customers. And as a result of that, he and his company could invest enormous sums and build out a real business, essentially a competitor to the banks, which is huge now, and it's growing all over Africa. So I think that's often the best way to scale up, particularly in the area of mobile technologies, to make a business out of it. And I think there's a key role for social entrepreneurs and aid agencies and others, which is to take on some of the early risk to help fund some of the R&D. I'd love to see like a National Institute of Development, the way there's a National Institute of Health, do basic research on what are some of the things that work, do some of the studies in the field to say these approaches are successful, so you're not constantly recreating the wheel. But ultimately, it's about connecting, I think, to existing domestic businesses and helping to build them and helping them take on these challenges. Like Sud, the media company in Senegal, you want to create a local incentive to grow a business.
Yeah, let's capture a couple behind.
So my question is about socially responsible
Mm-hmm.
giving and how most of the settlement institutions and often the politics of these institutions interfere with the best possible outcome. For example, you mentioned the Bush administration giving around $3 billion in aid, but for one of his programs, which was to prevent HIV and AIDS in Africa, it was that they weren't allowed to distribute condoms because of personal politics. So
Right.
how do you see the politics of these institutions? How can you overcome this? Like the personal politics interfering with what's best for the countries, and how can you, basically, how do you put the politics? How do you put the needs of those countries first over the politics?
I think there's always going to be this politics of institutions issues here and in the developing world. And that's why I think there's going to be a role for advocacy NGOs. So in a way, we're in this new era where companies are enlightened now and they sort of see how they want to do things in this very socially responsible way. But I still think you need advocacy groups because you're not going to necessarily have enough general understanding of the right approaches if there isn't somebody beating the drum. Now, sometimes advocacy groups have gone in all kinds of directions and maybe gotten too extreme on issues, and I'm sure somebody who knows more about them can come up with a really valid critique. But I think there's a role. It's not just enough, and it's partly this whole results focus. It's not just enough to say, hey, we're doing good things. See, we gave so much money for HIV. Right? It's about what did it achieve? And if you can show that because of a political restriction on condom distribution, the results weren't that good, then that ought to matter for something. And somebody ought to say, hey, did you see those results? And you compare them to this other program. And that ought to make some kind of change, and hopefully we're entering a system where it will.
Yeah. I have like two main questions. My first, kind of going off Valley, is that it seems like a lot of this is sort of like the highlights or like the pinpricks of light kind of in a sea of dark. And my question, I guess, is if these are the maybe like emerging abstract best practices that you're talking about, what do you think the timeline is for them to become a majority of practices and not just the rarity? And going off of that, like, what do you think are the most important changes to affect that?
I'm thinking, and maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but about 5 years. And what I'm thinking of specifically is that if you look at contracts coming out of some place like USAID, right, which is the world's biggest donor agency, right now, they may have a lot of great rhetoric at USAID about innovation and partnership, but they have a really hard time actually getting it into their really big projects, which might be a $100 million health project. Is it innovative? Is it focusing on partnership with business? They're trying to do it, and it's going to take a little time to do it, but I think once you see these new concepts being written into the request for proposals and the contracts, which is the main vehicle for foreign aid, that will start to swing the way this industry works. And it's starting to come already. It's really early, but just as an example, USAID has this really great innovative program for funding new technologies for development. So they funded this election monitoring system using cell phones in Afghanistan, right? Fairly small amounts of money, $100,000. Well, the problem is, let's say they find it really works. What next? And what I have advocated to them is when you find something works for $100,000, force it into some of your big contracts and grants. Say that we're going to put together this $10 million program, and by the way, we expect that the winner of the program has to use mobile technology at the best practices level to achieve these results, and we've already done some studies, so we know what it ought to cost. We know what the results ought to be. That's kind of coming, I think. And once that happens, that will be the tipping point. In a place like the UK, they have no choice. I mean, the entire country is focused on the fact that they're increasing their aid budget while cutting everything else, fire departments and police and everything else. So they've got no choice but to cook some of this into the way they approach these programs. So I'm perhaps overly optimistic, but I think it's really coming.
Okay, then going off of that, what do you think the largest challenge is external to the aid world that it will be facing in the next 20 years?
That the aid world will be
Yes,
facing.
like in terms of doing aid, what do you think the challenge is coming up elsewhere? Not within just like mergers and acquisitions or new ideas.
Well,
Just relate to everything else happening, kind of.
so you're saying, like, for example, what might be happening across all developing countries that will
Or,
impact.
like, the U.S. economy's total tank for the next decade.
Right.
Like that.
Right. Yeah. I think.
Small question.
Yeah, that's a small one. Well, there is an external pressure, which is the fact that most of the rich world, which funds aid, is in a serious fiscal crisis at the moment. And so the question is, will the wealthy countries of the world be able to get out of that? And the fact that aid is a relatively small amount of the budget, 1% here in the United States, will there be this coalition be able to sustain it? I tend to think yes, as I answered before. I think there will be a dip, but we'll sort of sustain that over time. I think the bigger question for the aid industry is, what is their role in various circumstances? So like I've talked quite a bit about the middle income countries. The role in Brazil is going to be really different from the role in Malawi. And I think it's about adapting to what's going on in the developing countries, not necessarily any other external factor. So what's the main driver of change in the development industry, I think, is the developing world. And everyone's just sort of woken up and said, that's not the same developing world that it always was. And these countries are in a very different position than they were. And they have, places like the Philippines and Indonesia and Thailand and Nigeria have tens of thousands of engineers and doctors and domestic businesses that are growing. So it's a different world, and that is going to be the biggest factor, I think, in terms of where aid agencies go.
There's some questions down at this end of the table.
Yeah.
Please.
How do you, wrote it down because I know I forget. Okay, how do you see the role of microfinance in this changing, where everything's changing, where, it wasn't really relevant at all, or, no one really knew about it back a long time ago. And do you think it's doing more harm than good?
I think it's doing more good than harm. I tend to think the people who are critics of microfinance often focus on the aspects that look really bad, like the interest rates are crazy and all that, but they don't necessarily look as much at the alternatives for the people who are taking those loans. I do think there in some cases may have been a frenzy of lending to people who don't really need it, or taking on too many loans. It's sort of the equivalent of our housing, prime mortgage problem here. That may have happened in some parts of the world, but I don't think that's an indictment on the concept of microfinance. I mean, microfinance is just really finance. It just happens to be small. So I think the idea here is bringing financial services to people who need them. And because of technology, there's now an ability to bring them to people who may have very small means, but still have requirements for banking. And not just lending, not just finance, but saving and insurance. There's huge opportunities in the insurance sector. Because if you look at, for example, smallholder farmers, how do they make a decision whether to plant an extra acre or to grow a particular crop versus another crop? They're all the risk is on them today as a farmer. And that's not the case if you're a corporation or a business. You take out insurance against risks. Someone else is helping you address and hedge your risks. So smallholder farmers don't have that opportunity, and that's one of the primary reasons they don't invest. So these kind of financial services on a micro scale, I think, can be hugely impactful in people's lives. So I tend to be positive about them as a general rule. I tend to think that their growth is associated with their marketability. So in a place like India, where you have, I think the chart was up there before, it's something like 76% of the country lives on $2 a day or less. There's going to be a huge potential market for microfinance. So big banks in India have seen this opportunity, and they're the ones who are likely to really scale it up. So I think that it will grow, but you need a role, obviously, for regulators to avoid some of the problems we just mentioned a moment ago.
Terrific. There's one back here.
I have two questions. First one,
Okay.
can you elaborate on this mergers and acquisitions model? Because the goal of merger and acquisition or these type of transactions is to raise profit margins or to eliminate competition. And so when you're dealing with a nonprofit company, do you find that maybe there's going to be less incentives to work with nonprofits when you're dealing with this model? And then the second question, I read that you're working political consulting, and I want to know how that has factored into your job or what you're doing now with development.
Okay. So on the first one, I think there is a real challenge of getting NGOs to merge, because you're right, there isn't the financial incentive isn't necessarily there. In the for-profit world, when management teams from two organizations merge, they may have an incentive, a financial incentive. In the nonprofit world, there may be a disincentive, because there's a chance that you lose your job as a result of this merger, because you don't need, there's a lot of replication perhaps. And there's also a chance that you lose your brand and something you feel really close to that you've helped build up. So I think there are these barriers to mergers and acquisitions, but I think eventually the financial requirements, there'll be funding pressure that is going to force a lot of these groups to say, hey, we can't be in 60 countries anymore. So we just don't have the donor base anymore, the resources. We're going to have to decide, do we really shrink down and become a smaller NGO that focuses on certain things? Or do we merge with another player so that together we can be in 60 countries and work in 7 sectors? I think there's going to be those kinds of external pressures that force this to happen, and it won't always be pleasant, and which is why I would advise NGO leaders to start really thinking about these issues now, before they're forced into them, and really decide strategically what's the right role for us 10 years from now in this new world. The political consulting work I did, I'm not sure it really influences my current job, but it does influence the way I look at development, which is kind of the way I look at everything, and that's through the political lens, having come out of that world. So it gets back to one of the questions we had here before. This is all political at some level, right? We're talking about people, we're talking about governments, and you can't neglect that aspect. So if you try to make development look like a purely coldly analytical economic formula, I think you miss a lot about what makes development fail or succeed. And so that does influence my perspective, but at least in the work I'm doing now, the political work I do is not quite as directly relevant, but I still have a bug and a passion for doing politics. Yeah, I see another question. There was one back there, and I'll come back.
So one of the major criticisms of those big aid organizations is that they're really focused on working for themselves and like perpetuating their own existence rather than what they should kind of actually be doing is making themselves obsolete.
Mm-hmm.
How does that kind of fit into your Aid 2.0 model of like how that will be shaped or be dealt with, and what kind of obstacle will that pose?
That's a good question. Yeah, I tend to think on the individual level, like if you meet an individual aid worker or executive in an NGO, that they're not thinking about perpetuating their job. But I do think that as a system, that is a natural outcome that could happen. And I think a lot of the agencies really proactively try to, and many of them write it down in their own materials and their own marketing to say, our job is to make sure we're not needed anymore. We're going to put ourselves out of business. I think the scale of global poverty and the inequities and the demands of things like institution building are so big that there's no way this industry is going to go out of business or work its way out of business in the short term. I don't see it. It would be a wonderful problem to have, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that eventuality. So I think what really matters if you're in this space is to constantly be thinking about, how do I be so successful in creating transformative change on this one problem I'm trying to address that I don't need to stay dedicated to that problem. It doesn't mean that you don't need to have a job anymore, your organization is going to go away, but that I can move on to the next problem or the next phase of that problem. And I think people psychologically are there, as I said, on an individual level, but it probably wouldn't hurt to make that part of the strategy around finding solutions to problems, to the extent it's not happening now. I think there's one here and one here.
So I guess I have like 3 more short interrelated.
All right.
What do you think are, for people interested in these issues and this type of work, what do you think are the best experiences for them to pursue in college and right after college? That's my first question.
So we were talking about this earlier, Brian and I think getting to the field, getting to developing country, I kind of hate even using the term field because it's back to the sort of old us-them model, but going to the developing world, going to the places you want to work. I think it'll help crystallize for you what you want to do and how it sort of speaks to you as a challenge. After college, depending on what kind of experience you had in college, if you've been overseas and, picking up and going sometimes even without a position is one opportunity. I would just encourage everybody to be really entrepreneurial in your thinking because we're going through a dynamic change. This is not like getting a job at a consulting firm where they come and recruit on campus. It's not, there are some bigger organizations that have kind of tracks and programs where they hire people at a certain level and bring you through, but that's the exception, not the rule. So you've got to be a bit entrepreneurial in your thinking. Doesn't mean you have to start your own organization, but you've got to kind of think of your career as, where do I fit in here, and chart your own path to a degree.
Cool. My second question is, I find it's kind of hard to get like actually good news analysis of development.
Mm-hmm.
So either you end up in like super dense academia or like super vague good. What would you say like the three best news sources consistently for you?
Well, you basically kind of stated our business plan. Okay, I wish I could record. I want that video so we can use it. So this is our weekly editorial meeting as a company. The challenge is that our business model is a lot like Bloomberg from the news perspective, which is to charge money for this stuff. So what we do is we have reporters around the world, and we're doing the business lens on development issues. And you're right, no one else actually covers that territory, in part because I don't think there was ever a model for it. So when we started this company, I was in graduate school. I really didn't know that much about development, other than that I really wanted to do it. And I asked a good friend who was working in this field, and my professor, who was the head of USAID under President Clinton, I was like, if I want to get a job in this field, how do I do this? Is there a website where it lists all the jobs? If I just want to read about what organizations are out there, where do I read that? I said, there's got to be a trade journal, right, or a magazine. And the answer was no, there's no trade journal, there's no magazine. I think the reason was it wasn't really a market. So everybody produced their own newsletter. They produced their own the World Bank would have its own magazine all about what the World Bank is doing and how great it is. But that's not what a market needs, right? We all need to know who's doing what's actually going on. So that is essentially the mission of Devex, is to connect everybody in this field and then inform them. And much of what we're doing is free, but some of the best stuff, some of the news analysis is really targeted at NGO execs and corporate execs and World Bank execs, et cetera, and we charge for that. So stay tuned, I guess is where
Is
I'll...
it possible for education institutions to get a subscription with that?
Some of it, yeah. We have something called a university membership, and so we basically make it inexpensive, as inexpensive as we can within our model. It's all, some of the higher level stuff is not available through that, but as much as we can, we do make available. I think there was it Nicole? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to go back. You kept saying the bubbling of the best ideas.
Yeah.
And the word best is bothering me. So we
Okay.
talked about microfinance.
Yeah.
We know that doesn't necessarily bring people out of poverty. It gives them
Right.
access to credit, which is great. People
Mhm.
need that, but it doesn't alter their entire life. And the same with, I'm worried if we're doing business models, we're going to make money. We'll define best by money, but what are we
Mhm.
doing to define best as more of the social, the human, the environmental side of things? Is the business sector, these PPPs, are we moving that way where we're not just talking about the economic return, but the transformation that's supposed to happen
Mhm.
for the people whose lives we're trying to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in this whole impact investing field, which is sort of like microfinance, but for the missing middle, right, for the small and mid-sized companies, the people that are involved in that space are trying to come up with hard metrics around social and environmental issues because they're worried that when they're competing with hard metrics around economic return, people can say, hey, look, it's sustainable. It's making all this money. It must be great. And the data you have around the social stuff is so soft that you can kind of massage it any way you want. I think it is a real challenge, a real issue. And it gets back to your point about long-term, how do you measure this stuff? So I guess I agree with the challenge. I don't think it's a reason not to do this. I don't think it's a reason not to be business-oriented. But I think it is a real challenge, and that's why there's going to continue to be a role for nonprofits I've met some people, it tends to be kind of people who are a little ideological about this stuff. So I've met, and there's kind of obviously people on both sides, but I've met some who said, why do we need NGOs anymore? Right? We're moving in this new world. Like, they're just kind of buzzing around and causing trouble, but they don't, what's the value? They're nonprofit. So they're not part of the sustainability. And I don't agree with that at all. I actually think there's a real role. If you look at impact investing, it's been created by nonprofits. Even though they're, business-minded and, really hard-headed about this, they're nonprofits. And partly because they're willing to risk some capital to create the market, partly because they're willing to invest in things that may not have a return up front, like how do you study social impact and how do we create metrics around that? So I don't have a pat answer to how to solve it, but I do think it's an absolute challenge in this space that we're going into. But even if we weren't going into this, we still have the same challenge, because so much of what happens today in development is more about the inputs. Did you spend the money on time? Than what were the actual results. So that measurement of impact is still going to be an issue regardless of whether you're attaching it to a business model or not. And attaching it to a business model probably means you're going to scale it up faster. You're going to make it sustainable. There's probably more benefits to doing that than not.
Terrific. Well, I know that this talk has been very beneficial to this community. So please join me in thanking Raj Kumar for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.